Four perspectives on the afterlife. And the first question is, what happens after we die? Well, it depends on who you ask. I will ask this from four perspectives, which are quite familiar to many, but perhaps I'll be able to say something which has escaped your attention so far. You can tell me afterwards. And I will first discuss Christianity, and especially Orthodox Greek Christianity in this respect. And my first part is based mostly on Bart Ehrman's book, Heaven and Hell. Bart Ehrman is a professor of New Testament studies, and he used to be a Christian, even fundamentalistic Christian, but he's not anymore. He considers himself as agnostic or even atheist. So he doesn't have any agenda to run in his works. He tries to root everything into historical facts as far as he can. And the second perspective comes from the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And it has this very interesting doctrine of three intermediate states. They are called bardos. And let's see how they turn out to be, and you might be able to compare these bardos with what Theosophy has to say. And the third perspective is from early Theosophy, the Mahatma Letters, and what Madame Blavatsky wrote about this topic. Many Theosophists still consider them the most authentic source of Theosophy, and I can understand it's a very good way to look at it, because they were the people who started Theosophy. However, after these first Theosophical teachers, or perhaps the main teachers, came other Theosophical authors who had some details to add, or perhaps slightly different perspectives. And the fourth perspective is what I call the Rosicrucian Theosophy. And by that I mean Pekka Ervast, who was a Finnish pioneer in the Finnish Theosophical movement, and Rudolf Steiner, who worked in Germany and all over the Europe, actually. And he was initially a Theosophical author, but later on he started in 1912, he started Anthroposophical Society. But anyway, he identified himself as a Rosicrucian when he started. I think he never abandoned that stream. Yes, so Christianity and the afterlife, and there are three main options. And you can see them here. I'll go through them one by one. But before doing so, it might be a good idea to say something about how Christians perceive the human being. St. Paul wrote that human being is body, soul, and spirit. So he clearly had this idea of threefold human being, which coheres well with what Theosophy has to say. However, later on, theologians and other Christians, they have largely abandoned the view of spirit. It's basically something which is associated with soul, or perhaps it's really nothing, because they are mainly talking about body and soul. This is an important distinction. And of course, the true Christians will be saved in that doctrine, and they go on living forever in one form or another. However, those who do not believe, they have three options. The first one is that eternal torment hell, which is familiar to everybody, basically. And it's still the default view, even though it's nowadays not preached in churches so much, at least in Finland. It's seldom even mentioned, but it's still there behind the curtains. And just put it mildly, I disagree with that view. But anyway, it's an interesting thing to see how it came to be. And the second view is annihilation. And Bart Ehrman, he states quite strongly that St. Paul and even Jesus had this idea that those who do not believe eventually will be annihilated. They will not be tormented forever. It's a somewhat nicer view. And finally, the third Christian view is that of universalism, and it means that eventually all would be saved. It's a minority view, but it does have quite prominent people in Christianity who believe in that. Okay, and let's see what St. Paul had to say about annihilation. So, first of all, St. Paul has in the New Testament, there are 13 letters which has his name on them, but critical historical research quite strongly states that only 7 of those letters are actually St. Paul's letters. The others are written by some people who perhaps were in his school of thought, but they were not written by St. Paul. And he stated that not all people will be saved, and good life can't save a person because nobody's without sin. And in the end, Christians will receive so-called resurrection bodies in which they live forever. This, by the way, is an interesting topic, resurrection body, because it does have some connections with Tibetan Buddhism and some other esoteric streams, but it's beyond the scope of this presentation. And this means that eternal life is not life in heaven, because it takes place in some kind of body, which is called that resurrection body. But before the final day, the judgment day, there's some kind of intermediate state, and during that time, Christians will live nearby the Christ, and non-believers will be further away from Christ, I suppose, but they will be annihilated according to Bart Ehrman's interpretation of St. Paul. And the early Christians, as everybody knows, they were waiting that the world will end soon, but it did not. And this was somewhat a crisis for them. And it demanded that the doctrines had to be, and Jesus' sayings had to be interpreted again. And according to Ehrman, it was done in the Gospels, which were written 40 or 60 years after Christ. And the kingdom of heaven changed from this world into the afterlife state. And this was the origin of heaven and hell as we know them today. And one important person in the 2nd century and 3rd century was Tertullian, and he presented that this doctrine of intermediate state. He had this book, which is in Latin De Anima, about the soul. And the soul leaves the body in death, and only the souls of martyrs will go directly to the paradise. Everyone else, good and bad alike, will go to Hades, which was supposed to be under the ground somewhere, or in the earth, inside the earth. And it meant that those who were righteousness and believed in Jesus, they were rewarded, and all the others, wrongdoers, they were punished. But this was just a temporary reward or punishment. And this division just became permanent only after the resurrection. And in Tertullian view, the punishment of the bad will continue forever, but in a different form. Later views of Christianity, you might say, are some kind of variations this teaching. But the Orthodox Church, I need to tell you that I used to belong in that church when I was young, but I left it some 20 years ago, and perhaps earlier on. But anyway, I find that it does have some interesting teachings regarding the death from the point of view of Theosophy. And they have this idea that the deceased will stay near the coffin for 3 days, and immediately when somebody dies, and if that's a churchgoer, they will have ceremonies for that purpose. They are called in Finland panihidas. I think it comes from Greek, the word, and they are some kind of prayers. And then after these 3 days, the soul will go to visit the paradise for 6 days. And that's interesting because in quite seldom you can find that these paradise cases come first. Typically in Theosophical view, it's the other way around. But anyway, this is how it goes. And the idea behind is that in those paradise situations, when the person or the soul encounters some virtues, like let's say graciousness, and if that person had while alive had that quality in himself or herself, then it feels this person is attracted to that virtue. But on the other hand, if the person did not have anything to do with graciousness, then this person is repelled by it. And the idea is that this is kind of a test or trial. What good qualities did the soul have or acquire during life? What idols did he serve? and what is the actual state from the point of view of virtues of the soul. And this is kind of enhancing self-understanding and knowledge. And after that, 40 days or 30 days, depending on the source, there will be the vice trials. And now what comes in the way are trials of different vices, like lust. They are idle talk, hate, cold-heartedness, occultism, and witchcraft, heretical views, and so forth. And they come in certain order, and there are 20 of them. And now what happens if the soul had acquired something related to this particular vice, that soul is strongly attracted towards it and can't resist the temptation. And they explicitly state that now, because there is no body, it's very difficult to resist any of these temptations if there is some correspondence in the soul. That's, I think, is quite interesting point of view. And then what happens? These vices are trials of vices. They are run by demons for some reason, and they have this special name. They are called the toll houses. It's kind of I thought it would be custom stations, but then I checked the translation. It's toll houses. And after that, the soul knows what good qualities it had or has, and then what bad qualities it has, and realizes that he or she is far away from salvation and needs the Savior. And still, at this point, saving the soul is still possible if that soul will go towards Christ. And then the Orthodox Church had these servings or ceremonies or praying for the soul, which might help in this process. And this is not what Catholic Church has, this purgatory. This is somewhat different, but on the other hand, it does have some similarities. But not many Orthodox Christians know about these toll houses. I certainly didn't, even though I attended courses in high school and so forth, and read even books after I started reading Theosophy. But I encountered this quite recently. But then I also read that some theologians, they feel that this teaching of toll houses is heresy. It's something like Gnostic teaching, but there are some quite prominent people within the Orthodox Church who do teach this because they were taught by some church fathers. And then the final outcome is in the judgment day, there will be no need for the God to judge anyone because the person has kind of developed into that direction which was chosen in life. And after this self-understanding and so forth, and then the actual judgment is done by the soul itself. It's the own verdict in front of God saying yes or no. You could say this is kind of a second death if the person doesn't live on. Okay, and the third one is universalism, and typically this is I suppose familiar to many in the circles of Theosophy, because Origen of Alexandria thought this notion of apokatasis, which means restoration of creation to a condition of perfection. And he also thought that souls have pre-existence before they actually born. And this is something which was deemed to be heretical in 553 in Constantinople. But Origen had initially even a notion of reincarnation, and he thought that suffering will purify and eventually save everybody. That's why he's kind of the father of universalism. And the thing is that in theosophical books I can read in Finnish and in English as well, that the Second Council would have stated that reincarnation is a heresy, but they didn't have to do so. It wasn't widespread in the church anymore. It did appear in the early Christianity among the Gnostics and some other parishes, but not anymore. So they didn't have to do that. There is no mention about reincarnation, but one might say that pre-existence of souls is kind of a necessary condition for reincarnation. If you deny that, then by implication, you deny reincarnation. And what about today? Are there any people who would be supporting this universalism in which everybody will be saved? And the answer is positive. Yes, there are. Perhaps not so much, but there are. For instance, the British Bishop Callistus Ware, I don't know how to pronounce his name properly, but Callistus Ware, he has written that it's something which can't be taught in the church, but it's something which can be prayed for and hoped for, because that would be a Christian thing to do. And quite recently, a notable theologian in the Orthodox Church called David Bentley Hart, he's American, wrote a book that all shall be saved, and he forcibly defended universalism because he felt that it has very good case. He could make a very good case from the early Christianity, and he felt that it's impossible that anybody could be condemned to eternal hell. And he's a heavyweight in the circles of theologians, so he's not just a guy saying something. And that was quite a surprise for many who had followed his work, even outside Orthodox Church, because he has written some books which have reached large audiences. Anyway, I think it's a good sign from the point of theosophy that these things are discussed, because the notion of eternal hell, I think it has done a lot of damage over the centuries for so many people. Okay. And I hope that I'm not going too fast, but this is then the second perspective, the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And many theosophists have probably read this Bardo Thodol in English, which was published first in 1927 by Evans Wentz. And I've learned only later on that experts in Tibetan Buddhism intensively dislike it. And there are reasons behind it. And one reason is that Evans Wentz himself didn't know any Tibetan language, but he had somebody who did know, who did the actual translation work. But later on, afterwards, he published several editions of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and he increased his commentary, and the commentaries were written from the point of view of Hinduism or Theosophy, because he was a Theosophist who practiced yoga and knew many prominent Hindu teachers, yogis at the time. And one reason why they dislike this interpretation is that it's not done from the point of view of Tibetan Buddhism and from that context, but it's done by completely different points of view. And they feel that there are problems with the translation as well. But in 2005, the first complete translation appeared, which is much larger collection of text than what Evans Wentz ever published. And it was translated by prominent people who were both scholars in religion and Tibetan Buddhism themselves. And Dalai Lama wrote an introduction to the book, and it's considered to be the gold standard nowadays in that sense. And what can we say about the Tibetan Book of the Dead? There are at least three possible interpretations, and one is that it is a description of what happens after we die. But many Buddhists who follow that think it's a spiritual guide, and people who practices Buddhism in everyday life and do these meditations, and they feel that they can follow the book and use them as a source and guide for their meditation practice. And then the third aspect is that when somebody is about to die, a lama or somebody who knows this text very well comes and starts reading the book when the person is dying. And that reading is kept on for up to 49 days. But that happens quite rarely because it's quite consuming to have 49 days, day and night. There must be many people involved, so it's quite expensive even. But anyway, that's how long it can be sustained. And the first intermediate state is the time of death. And that starts when respiration has ceased. And in that case, The vital energies, which are called in Sanskrit prana and long in Tibetan, have been absorbed into the central energy channel of the body. Then the inner radiance of reality, or some texts say it's the clear light, which I quite like, arises in the mind of dying person. This happens to every person, regardless of their spiritual advancement. And it's the first opportunity for liberation or enlightenment. The duration of the inner radiance depends on the experience with the spiritual practice and the conditions of the energy channels, which are described in a very similar manner as in Hinduism or yogic texts. For a negative person with unhealthy channels, this may be only a very brief moment, which is called a snap of the fingers. Ordinary people experience a loss of consciousness which may last up to 3.5 days. In the next phase, the vital energy leaves the body. Then the inner radiance of the path will arise and the consciousness becomes awake and lucid. However, the deceased may not know whether they have died. The deceased cannot talk but can see and hear the relatives, but they cannot see or hear the deceased. The emerging of the vital energy can happen through any of the 9 gates of the body. The point of exit is very important. If the consciousness leaves through the crown of the head, one will attain liberation. Also, the eyes and the left nostril are considered optimum exit points because they allow the incarnation in human form, which is the only form in which, according to Buddhism, enlightenment is possible. As is the case in the first inner radiance, the nature of instructions provided depends on the level of practice the deceased has attained. Remember, in Buddhism, if the person doesn't practice, the person is not considered to be a Buddhist. For instance, if the deceased was engaged with the practices at an advanced level, they are addressed as follows. "O child of Buddha nature, meditate on this, your meditational deity. Do not be distracted." Alternatively, if the deceased was an ordinary person, the instruction is prefaced thusly: "Meditate on the Lord of great compassion." Now, if the consciousness recognizes the inner radiance, liberation is attained, and there is no need to have rebirth. However, if liberation is not attained, the intermediate state of reality, which is the second Paro, will arise. The phenomena of sounds, lights of colors, let me see. And rays of light will arise. And deceased may faint with fear, terror, or awe. The deceased is reminded that however horrifying the appearances of the intermediate states of reality might be, through them the recognition may be attained. Those who have been unconscious for up to 3.5 days will now awaken. They are urged to recognize the intermediate state of reality. On each day, different entities will arise. For instance, on the first day, the Lord Vairocana, white in color from the central Buddha feet, will arise. From Vairocana's heart, a blue luminosity will emanate and shine piercingly so that one's eyes cannot bear it. At the same time, a dull white light from the realm of gods will dawn. The deceased is instructed to have confidence in the brilliant light and not to be attached to the dull light, which is an obstruction for the liberation and leads to the cycles of existence in one of the 6 realms or lokas, those of the gods, demigods, humans, animals, hungry ghosts, and hell beings. As you know, in all variations of Buddhism, person can be reincarnated or have a rebirth in among as an animal or in any of these lokas. And it's considered to be good luck to be born as a human being. So, for instance, on the first day, the dull white light would lead to rebirth in the god realms. However, if the inner radiance of pristine cognition is recognized in the form of Vairocana Buddha, Buddhahood is attained. Other peaceful deities will arise in turn in the following 6 days. Each of them has a body of a different color, and each of them will shine a piercing light of a certain color. The deceased is reminded that they are due to the natural expressive power of your own awareness. Along with the peaceful deities, the colored dull lights from the 6 realms will dawn. These may appear delightful for the deceased with negative past actions. If liberation is not achieved when encountering the peaceful deities and the deceased has not been attracted to the lower realms, the 58 wrathful, blood-drinking deities will arise during the next 7 days. These are a transformation of the peaceful deities, although they have a very different appearance. Recognition and liberation are more difficult in this phase, as fear, terror, or awe easily overpower the deceased. Subsequently, consciousness may continually fade. On the other hand, because of the terrifying appearance, the awareness is one-pointedly concentrated. This means that liberation would actually be easy, even with the slightest recognition. The deceased continues to receive oral instructions aimed at helping them to recognize the wrathful deities as the Buddha body of one's own intrinsic awareness. The deceased is reminded that the wrathful deities cannot harm the mental body because emptiness cannot be harmed by emptiness. I quite like this. This is very nice instruction. And then, finally, the next case is the final third. Paro is called the intermediate state of the rebirth. And this happens or takes place if the person hasn't been liberated already. And the person finds himself or herself in the mental body. It has all the sense faculties, and it has the ability to move without obstruction, which is a sign that one is indeed wandering in the intermediate state of the rebirth. The mental body is visible to other deceased having a similar kind of rebirth. It can also be perceived those who have advanced clairvoyance. The deceased will once again see their relatives as if in a dream. The relatives can't respond to the deceased who realizes being dead. This causes intense suffering. The fierce hurricane of past actions, some translations call this the winds of karma, will drive the deceased, who will also face an unfathomable darkness. Very negative beings will arise, and the deceased will imagine that hordes of people pursue them. Terrifying sounds will be heard. The terrified deceased will try to flee and find shelter with no success. On the other hand, individuals with merit will experience blissful states. Whatever the case, the deceased is instructed not to be attached to the experiences. If the deceased cannot meditate in the right way, the innate good conscience will gather all virtuous actions and count them with white pebbles. In a similar manner, the innate bad conscience will gather all non-virtuous actions and count them with black pebbles. The deceased will tremble with fear and try to lie, but this is in vain, since Yama, the embodiment of the forces of the laws of cause and effect, will consult the mirror of past actions. Yama will then repeatedly cut the mental body of the deceased, which will cause enormous suffering. Again, the deceased is instructed that emptiness cannot harm emptiness. The liberation is still possible if the deceased will regain their focus and succeeds in recognition. In case liberation is not achieved, the 6 dull lights of the 6 realms will emerge, and the mental body of the deceased will have the color of the light of the realm into which the rebirth will take place. As before, the deceased will be pursued by whirlwinds and a crowd of people. Those lacking merit will flee toward a place of suffering, whereas those with merit reach a place of happiness. Then the signs of the environment of the next rebirth will arise, which means that the intermediate state of the rebirth is closed. The deceased will see a male and female, these could be humans or animals, engaging in sexual intercourse. The various instructions on how to obstruct the womb entrances will be read to the deceased. In the case the womb entrance is not avoided, the deceased is instructed on how to choose rebirth that will be beneficial for the continuation of spiritual practice. To conclude, according to the text, rebirth is something to be avoided, if possible. It's interesting that liberation is available in each stage of the afterlife, on each bardo, even at the very gates of the rebirth. This is quite different from Theosophy, as we shall see. And I wrote an article about this with my good friend Tommi Tolmunen, and it was published in Quest, the Theosophical Society in America, and we got great help from one expert in Tibetan Buddhism who read the first manuscript, and he was the one pointing out that you can't really use that Evans body, because if you Evans Wentz's translation, because if that translation is used, experts will immediately stop reading because they think it can't be good. So we completely rewrote this article, and then I think it became better, and we're so grateful for Dr. Tiso for his wonderful advice. Okay, so let's turn to stages in the Mahatma Letters, which are very familiar to any Theosophist. And I'd like to say that I had an opportunity to read the actual original letters in the British Library in last summer when we visited London. And I felt when I opened them and read them and compared them with each other, it felt like I was privileged in the way that because Theosophists believe that they came directly from the masters themselves. But let's see what the teaching is from the point of view of death. And these letters are written by K.H. and M., Kuthumi and Moria, and they wrote to the British journalist A.P. Sinnett between 1880 and 1884. And the letters addressed central teachings in Theosophy and dealt with the stages which a deceased individual passes through the afterlife. And the Theosophical author, Geoffrey Farthing, some of you may have known him, compiled the afterlife teaching of these letters into a wonderful small booklet called When We Die. It's available on the internet, freely available. And that includes also some quotes from writings of H.P. Blavatsky. And there are some differences with the early Theosophy and later Theosophy in terms of how the human being is understood. And perhaps one difference is that what we now call etheric body was in these letters called astral body. And that is one difference. And then another difference is that life force or prana was considered to be a principle. Nowadays, it's typically not considered a principle because there are just differences, but it really doesn't make any great difference because life force and prana belongs to any theosophical description of the human being. And important distinction between this is that personality, it consists of these four principles, and then individuality of these three higher principles. And this individuality is what is immortal and which passes from one incarnation to another, whereas personality is just for one incarnation alone. There are some special cases, perhaps if somebody dies at a very early age and then reincarnates quickly, then it's basically the same personality because that kind of person hasn't passed through the long stages of afterlife but has reincarnated quickly. And these cases have been investigated by, for instance, in Virginia, University of Virginia, Ian Stevenson and his followers and successors. And there are something like 2,500 of such cases documented. So it's quite impressive. So let's see what life review is, how it's described in the Mahatma Letters. I'll read a passage of this. At the last moment, the whole life is reflected in our memory and emerges from all the forgotten nooks and corners, picture after picture, one event after the other. The dying brain dislodges memory with a strong supreme impulse, and memory restores faithfully every impression entrusted to it during the period of the brain's activity. The brain thinks, and the ego lives, over in those few brief seconds, his whole life over. This is, as far as I know, the first description of life review in theosophical sources. It had been described a bit earlier in the 19th century in some texts which were perhaps not largely known, and in some French texts as well. But this is quite one of the first one that I'm aware. And then it may happen that some kind of apparition, which is called Maya Virupa, can manifest itself to a friend or to a loved one, but it can't speak or communicate unless the dead person is an initiate. And Mahatma Letters describe this possibility. So it can be possible that these apparitions take place. But then there is transition to Kamaloka, which is nowadays called typically astral world. And it takes place after the life review, and personality dies irreversibly. That's what Farthing states, and based on the Mahatma Letters. And this is immediately followed by loss of consciousness and transition to Kamaloka, the world of emotions and desires. Quote begins. Thus, when man dies, his soul becomes unconscious and loses all remembrance of things internal as well as external. Every just disembodied fourfold entity loses all recollection. It is mentally annihilated. It sleeps its akashic sleep in the Kamaloka. This state lasts from a few hours, rarely less, days, weeks, months, sometimes to several years. Quote ends. And after this, which is basically sleep without any dreams, the death struggle and gestation takes place. And this is at the end of, or near the end of, the unconscious period in Kamaloka. And it means that all the good in personality is sifted out. This is followed by so-called gestation state, during which the good qualities of the personality are assimilated into the sixth principle, or buddhi. Quote begins. When man dies, his second and third principles, etheric body and prana, will die with him. The lower triad disappears, and the fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh principles from the surviving fourfold structure. Thenceforth, it is a death struggle between the upper and lower dualities. If the upper wins, the sixth, that is buddhi, having attracted to itself the quintessence of good from the fifth, that is manas, its noble affections, its saintly, though they be earthly aspirations, and the most spiritualized portions of its mind, follows its divine elder, that is the seventh Atman, into the gestation state, and the fifth and fourth remain in association as an empty cell. Quote ends. So, according to the Mahatma Letters, the ordinary person is unconscious up to the gestation state, which will bring forth consciousness and memory as well as a second life review. And all the memories again come back to this person, or should we say individuality, because then the heaven is near, which is called Devachan in the Mahatma Letters. It's a term from Indian philosophy, and it's blissful, although it is a subjective dreamlike state. Quote begins. He is completely engrossed in the bliss of all his personal earthly affections, preferences, and thoughts, and gathers in the fruit of his meritorious actions. No pain, no grief, nor even the shadow of a sorrow comes to darken the bright horizon of his unalloyed happiness, for it is a state of perpetual maya. Since the consciousness, the perception of one's personality on earth is but an evanescent, hard to pronounce, dream, that sense will be equally that of a dream in the Devachan, only 100-fold intensified. Quote ends. The bliss of this heavenly state is not eternal. It will come to an end, and the process of a new incarnation will commence. Karma will determine the conditions for the new incarnation and the properties of the new personality, which are called skandhas. The term comes from Buddhism, but it's used in the Mahatma Letters and by Blavatsky as well. Before the new incarnation, the reincarnating ego sees a preview of its forthcoming life. I haven't found that in the Mahatma Letters, but that's what Blavatsky writes, and that's what Farthing writes in his little book. Perhaps a comment or two on the Mahatma Letters is in order. So many Theosophists regard only the Mahatma Letters and the Blavatsky's works as reliable teachings about the afterlife stages, as well as about Theosophy in general. I am quite sympathetic to this stance, since from the Theosophical perspective, the masters are masters precisely because they know the secrets of life and death. Nevertheless, it may be that they did not, for one reason or another, reveal all their knowledge of the afterlife to Synod in their letters from the early 1880s. And this is what I'm going to address next, the fourth perspective, Rosicrucian teaching on the afterlife. And as I mentioned, this is based on Pekka Ervast and Rudolf Steiner's teachings. The first comes life review. I will read you quotes from Ervast first and then Steiner. Quote begins. Therefore, a person reviews the past life in all its details, although this happens very fast. What has happened in life through the decades is seen within half an hour as films in memory, yet everything happens in detail while the person is outside the whole play. He just watches the great play and judges it objectively, calling each thing, depending on its own quality, as good or bad, prime or merit, and so on. He remains in a great light, so to speak. Quote ends. And then Steiner. Quote begins. Immediately after death, the whole past life from birth to death stands before the soul simultaneously, like a long series of pictures. But this memory tableau, hard word again, does not quite resemble experiences themselves, which we had here on earth. There, our experiences were linked up with feelings and soul impressions. The soul was inwardly interested in them. Now, however, all these experiences comforts the soul in a collection of external objective experiences. Every pain, every joy, once connected with them, is silent. This life picture faces the soul as if it were quite estranged from it. The feelings and moods are lacking. I see myself, my relatives, and my friends within an objective panorama of pictures. This picture stands before the soul until the etheric body separates from the astral body. Quote ends. So the important point of view from both of these Rosicrucian teachers is that life review takes place objectively, and it doesn't have any attached feelings with it, and the person is able to judge these actions. And Erva states the reason why it is possible. It is because this life review takes place in the light of the higher self. It's not the personality who judges what has happened in life, but it's actually the higher self. And then, transition to astral world takes place. According to Ervast, the person spends a few days conscious in the etheric body before transition to the astral world, just like Steiner does. Sometimes a person can communicate with the loved one in Ervast's teaching. Quote begins. A person remains in this etheric body about 3 days after death, sometimes taking less time and sometimes taking a longer time. It has happened for many that their dear father or some other relative has appeared, smiled, and assured them that all is well with him. And if a person has a calm mind and is a bit sensitive, he may have a conversation with the deceased. Quote ends. And then, when the silver etheric cord is sliced, then transition to astral world or Kamaloka takes place. But this phase takes a couple of days when the person loses their consciousness for a day or two before the transition to what Ervast calls Hades, that is the astral world. And astral world has different planes, as we well know from theosophical teaching. The underworld is what one might say it's like hell, and then dwellings of Hades. It's slightly better, but it's gray and tedious. And if the person, even a good person, is attached to materialism and attachment to mundane life, then this is where that person starts. But when the purification process continues, that kind of soul will continue and go further to earthly paradise, which is sometimes called the Summerland. And it's actually quite nice. The person has the ability to enjoy science and arts, and religious people are there. But then that is not all. Emptiness starts to come into mind, and the person or the soul understands that this is not the end of the road, but there are higher ideals waiting, which is the spirit. But anyway, the main point in these different stages of astral world is go through judgment about the evil with oneself. And In life review, evil was recognized, all these deeds which were not good, which couldn't stand in the presence of the higher self. But in this, which is called sometimes purgatory, and these feelings, everything that we made others feel, we must feel ourselves, which might be quite painful. Let me read you two descriptions of this. Quote begins from Everest. In the first phase of this life in purgatory, he makes judgments about all the evil within himself. He sees his mistakes and grows away from that evil. When he settles in Hades, he starts to meditate on purifying himself. He relives his life, he sees his life backward and lives it again. He concentrates his attention on his weaknesses. This is not meditation, no, it is real life, but he experiences a lot at the same time. And Steiner describes Kamaloka thusly, quote begins, consciously or unconsciously, intentionally or unintentionally, a person causes pleasure and pain, joy and sorrow to animals and men. All such occasions he will encounter again as he lives through the Kamaloka period. He returns to the place and moment when he was the cause of pain to another being. At that time, he made someone else feel pain. Now he has to suffer the same pain in his own soul. There is no way of avoiding it. All this is part of the process of freeing oneself, not from the working of karma, but from early things. Quote ends. Both Ervast and Steiner state that life in the astral world lasts about a third of the life spent on Earth, so about the same time that we sleep. Moreover, people are not left without help in their suffering. They receive help both from the living and the dead. Living people providing this kind of help, or should I say counseling, are compassionate in their daily lives and can help the dead while sleeping. The helpers who are themselves dead have received, for instance, theosophical knowledge on the afterlife while alive. If this is true, it means that reading and thinking about the afterlife may indeed have quite far-reaching consequences in our personal afterlife. We can be more aware and we can be of help, because one aspect of a theosophist is that that person strives to be more compassionate person and helpful for others. And this can manifest itself in the afterlife stages as well. And then the second death takes place. Just like the Mahatma Letters, Ervas describes the sifting of the good from the bad. However, Ervas doesn't talk about this phase as regaining consciousness or memory, because consciousness and memory was with the person already during these even painful stages. So there are some differences there. But then life in Devakan is pretty much the same, or described in the same terms as in the Mahatma Letters. Life in the heavenly realm is blissful, although it's subjective and dreamlike. And I'll read the quote again. In heaven, a human being relives his earthly life, but with no sorrows, disappointments, contradictions, or dissonance. He relives that earthly life again in such a form that all the good that he has wished for, longed for, thought for, felt, and strived for comes true thousandfold. The best personal self of human being takes part in heaven. He is what he was at his best moments on earth when he loved, willed good, and did good. Quote ends. The bliss of heavenly state is not eternal. It will come to an end, and the process of a new incarnation will commence. Karma will determine the conditions for the new incarnation and the skandhas, or properties of the new personality, just like in the early Theosophy and the Mahatma Letters state. Before the new incarnation, the reincarnating ego sees a preview of its forthcoming life. Madame Blavatsky, Ervast, and Steiner have all similar teaching regarding this. And Ervast describes this quite beautifully as follows. Quote begins. The new earthly life presents itself to us. We see what is waiting for us. We see that we must step down to earth and clothe ourselves in a new personality. We see the lesson we have to learn in this new life, and we kneel down in our spirit and are immensely grateful to life for the opportunity to go to the school of life. Quote ends. So everyone in this regard has wanted to be born again, because this physical plane or the earthly life is the only possibility for people to evolve and to balance their karma and to become the helpers of the humankind. So, there are some final thoughts which I'd like to share. And as we have seen, there are interesting similarities and differences between these four perspectives regarding teaching of the afterlife. And it's quite natural that everyone is committed to the teachings in their religious or philosophical tradition. I'm no exception to this, as my background is in the Finnish Rosicrucian Theosophy. The similarities between the teachings suggest that many traditions have spiritual knowledge, even empirical knowledge of the afterlife. Moreover, one might have the fifth perspective from the scientific research on near-death experiences. People who have died or almost died often have remarkably similar descriptions of leaving the body, having lucid consciousness, observing life review, and meeting deceased relatives and angel-like entities. Naturally, these experiences do not cover the whole afterlife process, although some near-death experiencers have seen reincarnation taking place. It is sometimes said that one should not ponder death. Instead, we should live the life we have right now. There is some wisdom in this. This life is indeed extremely important. However, I'm convinced that reading and thinking about the afterlife helps us to gain a deeper understanding of life in general, as well as everyday life. Death offers us purification, but not actual advancement in the spiritual path. This is the work we must do here on earth. Death shows us like a clear mirror of what we are as human beings. The sight may not be very nice in all respects. Fortunately, it is possible to look in the mirror now and start striving for truthfulness, purity, compassion, and love. Thank you.